Welcome back to MMA Al Dente. I am the guy who picked Czech Congo to defeat Mark Hunt. And I'm here to talk about Bobby King Green versus Jim fucking Miller, or Jim A10 Miller. This is a battle between two of the most seasoned vets ever, and these guys are going to throw down in the second fight of the night. On any other fight night, pay-per-view or otherwise, this would be the people's main event. But I already used that term, that moniker for Gaethje versus Holloway, so I guess not. But this is still an awesome matchup, and this is a fight that I always would have predicted Bobby Green to win by decision. But I'm picking Jim Miller for this fight. I'm still going to bet on Bobby Green winning by decision, and I really have essentially, with just the over-under staring at me. But Jim Miller's my pick and my bet as far as the money line goes. I think Jim is looking great for a 40-year-old. I'm aware of the context to his knockouts because he's gotten a bunch of knockouts lately. He hadn't had a knockout since Kamal Shalarus in round 3 back in fucking the 90s or whatever that was, 2012 or something. And since then, he hadn't had a knockout up until the last few years. And then he's knocked guys dead. Eric Gonzalez, Nicholas Mota, Jesse Butler. And I'm aware these aren't the best fighters and they don't have the strongest chins. But Jim still has knockout power. Even in a bunch of his submission wins, he's knocked guys silly. Clay Guida, Alex White, whoever the fuck. He's definitely got some sharp power, and I'd say he's got the single hardest punch in this fight, his left hand. But he's at a disadvantage with hands altogether. That's Bobby Green's advantage in this fight and in most fights, his hands. He's got superior boxing. Bobby will boxy up Jim Miller. I think he would, in a boxing match, double up the volume and just touch Jim relentlessly with straight, sharper strikes and win that fight. And, of course, that would entail keeping the fight standing because I'm assuming if they were fighting that fight, Jim would have shot takedowns. And that's the fight I always would have predicted. Bobby keeps the fight standing and outpoints Jim on the feet. But Jim's just looked a little sharper lately where I'm favoring him. I do think he's got the overhand punch power. I think he's got a sharper kicking game, which could throw Bobby off. And I think his wrestling has looked sharp, at least in the Gabriel Benitez fight, in the last fight. In the second half of that fight, he turned it on with some power doubles and was ripping Benitez to the mat. And Bobby Green's a very good wrestler. Both guys are wrestlers first and foremost. But Bobby Green is a guy with thinner hips. And I think if Jim was able to take him down, I don't think he'd be able to control him, basically, hold him down and keep that basic wrestler control. But Jim can turn a corner and lock his legs around you and get that jiu-jitsu control, turning it into a jiu-jitsu match. And he's very quick to turn a wrestling match into a jiu-jitsu match. Jim comes alive when he's on the ground. So I think Jim's got ways of controlling Bobby and even on the feet, controlling him and getting by that boxing, keeping this from just being a boxing match. But let me look into the finishes, I guess the losses, just to give this fight a little more context. Bobby Green has been tapped out, but both times were in 2009. One was to Dan Lozon on the Affliction card. You're damn right I ordered that on pay-per-view. He was tapped out in 2009 to good fighters, and it's been 15 years and no one's gotten him since. But just like I said about Gabriel Benitez, if there's one guy who could tap him for the first time in over a decade, it's Jim fucking Miller. Jim is just that dynamic on the ground where, yeah, that's on the table. I'd still be surprised, though, if either guy got a submission victory, but just know that Jim's dangerous enough to get it done. As for Bobby Green's knockout losses, he's got 5 TKOs or knockouts. The first one was a TKO to Tim Means in King of the Cage, and that was a loss due to exhaustion. He was beaten up and hurt and exhausted at the end of round 2, and it was a corner stoppage or whatever. But he didn't come out for round 3. That was pretty early, too. I don't know the year, but it was way back. And then in the UFC, he was knocked out by Dustin Poirier at UFC 199, one of the best events ever. And he was talking shit as he was knocked out. And then he's been knocked out recently by Drew Dober and Jalen Turner, guys that have power and physicality that Jim Miller does not have. And the same goes for Poirier, to be frank. So I'm aware that even though his chin has failed him a bunch lately, and that includes being knocked down by Tony Ferguson, it's still been to more dangerous guys than Jim Miller. Also, he had a TKO loss to Islam Makhachev, which was pretty much a grappling loss. That was last year, 2 years ago, or whatever. But he was pinned, mounted, and pounded. And totally a positional loss, but a TKO. So while he's looked vulnerable lately, and Jim has looked extra sharp with his power, I'm aware that he's lost. He's been knocked out by guys that hit like fucking light heavyweights. And Jalen Turner is probably an actual light heavyweight. He just doesn't know it yet. As for Jim Miller, he's been knocked out twice. Dan Hooker and Cowboy Cerrone. Those are two longer, taller strikers with kicks and knees, which is what got him out of there. And that's it in his however long career he's had. Only 2 times he's been finished with strikes, and that's it. I'd be really surprised if Bobby Green was the next guy to knock Jim Miller out. But make no mistake about it, if that was the case, first thing I'd be saying is, well, he's 40. He was too old. Because hindsight is fucking 20/20. But again, he looks sharp right now for a 40-year-old, and I'd be surprised, I'm saying that here before the fight, if he got knocked out. Jim has been submitted a few times, though, by some very good submission artists. Charles Oliveira got him out of there with the rear naked choke. Nate Diaz got him out of there with a guillotine. That was a main event and an awesome fight. He was also tapped by Michael Chiesa, who's a fucking top game monster and a natural lightweight at the time, but it wasn't too long before his nature moved him up to welterweight. And he was also tapped by Pat Healy, which is a no contest, but Healy got him out of there down the stretch and then tested positive for the reefer. So they had to take that fight away. And his bonuses, because, reefer, come on. We're living in a society here. But, if Bobby Green was to submit Jim Miller, it would be one of those round 3 submissions. He's gotten them, the round 3 arm triangle and Tony Ferguson, that beautiful finish he had early in his UFC career, the rear naked choke over Jacob Volkman, who was a total neutralizing wrestler. It would be one of those, but I'd be very surprised if he or anybody really tapped out Jim Miller, unless he's fighting fucking Charles Oliveira again. So I think if Bobby Green was to win, I'd be very sure it goes the distance. Very sure. And if Jim Miller was to win, I'd still favor it going the distance. But again, Bobby's looked a little more vulnerable lately. That chin has been rocked many times despite all the context. And Jim Miller is also fucking so dynamic on the ground. And he showed in that Gabriel Benitez fight that he can be that guy that is the first one to submit you in 10 years. So I've just played the money line because there's no props anyway yet. But money line for Jim Miller, plus 150. That's got my bet. And I'll wait to play Bobby by decision, but I've played the over at minus 145 because I consider that a bet on Bobby Green and even partially on Jim Miller, or mostly on Jim Miller. So that's the real value in my opinion. But Jim Miller plus 150, definitely enticing enough for me to play. And you know what? He is my pick. I think it's a grimy fight. I think this one goes everywhere. And I think it's very close. But I think Jim Miller keeps this from being a pure boxing match and wins this fight. Like, share, subscribe, all that horse shit, and check out my other videos.